Kings Island is probably my favorite amusement park. As much as I love the charm of Canada's Wonderland and the incredible ride lineup of Cedar Point, Kings Island is able to blend both of those elements together pretty much perfectly. I haven't visited this park properly in almost 3 years. Other than Winterfest in December of 2019, the last time was in July of 2019. And from then to now, well, let's just say my perspectives on rides have changed a lot. However, all that is no more. On Easter weekend 2022, I made a trek down to Kings Island for 3 days, including pass holder preview day and opening day. This was my first time at a preview day, as well as my first proper opening day. These 3 days had a great change on my opinions toward the park and its coasters, as well as being the perfect way to get back into the amusement park's spirit. The day started with a 5.5-hour ride down to Mason. It's been over 2 years since I last crossed the border, so I was definitely a bit more anxious than normal. After crossing though, it was fairly smooth sailing down the I-75 for most of the journey. We got to the park around 11:30, and already there was a massive crowd. We were lucky that we arrived this early, as the line for the gates eventually reached all the way to the security checkouts. Once getting into the park, I had to make a tough decision. Which coaster do I ride first? I wasn't quite sure, but once the rope dropped, my body began moving on its own, and before I knew it, I was standing in front of the queue line for Banshee. Banshee was a coaster that, although I did like in 2019, I had ridden it before I really fell in love with inverts, and so I assumed I didn't like it as much as I would have otherwise. And my hypothesis was entirely correct. Over the 3 days, I got 10 or 11 rides on Banshee, and after them, I can definitely say that this has moved, if not into my top 10, then right close to it. Actually, I want to try keeping a track of how my opinions change over this year. So, as of before this trip, here's what my top 15 looked like. At the end of 2022, we'll check back to see how much it's changed. After that great morning ride, I decided to knock out the other thrill coaster in this section, Invertigo. Now, Invertigo is an interesting coaster. You wouldn't expect a coaster with a boomerang layout and SLC restraints to be that good, but every ride I've gotten on Invertigo has knocked it out of the park. It's really confusing how amazing Invertigo really is, but it leaves me floored every time. Following 2 pretty short waits for Banshee and Invertigo, that streak came to an end as I decided to tackle my biggest reason for returning to Kings Island, that being Orion. Let's take things all the way back to the nice, peaceful year of 2020. I was poised to go to Kings Island for the pass holder preview and opening days that year around April 9th. About a month before this deadline, we got an extension of our March break for another 2 weeks to calm this new, strange bug going around. Fast forward almost exactly 2 years, and, well... I guess we missed that deadline. For 2 years, Orion was the one that got away. Just barely didn't get to it by a series of cataclysmic unfortunate events. Now, however, though, that was about to change. For the first time, I stepped foot into the new Area 72, walked past the amazing new decorations for Flight of Fear, popped my stuff into a locker, and went to go ride Orion. Well, not before a 45-minute wait, though. I was actually surprised by how short the queue was for Orion, though. Because I've been left with just Leviathan and Behemoth as a reference point, I got used to over-hour waits for big B&Ms. However, I forgot to take one massive wait time detriment into account. Bags. Bags have almost single-handedly destroyed Leviathan in my opinion. Waits that should only be 30 or 40 minutes end up being over an hour because it takes so much longer for people to do the seat shuffle, swim through the hordes of people getting off, place their stuff in the bins, go back, and then finally do the restraints. And then when they get off, they become that horde of people. As much as lockers can be annoying, they make operations so much better and make the ride experience just better in general. I mean, Canada's Wonderland already kinda solved this with Yukon Striker, but oh yeah, it's been 3 years and not a single other coaster has implemented it. So much for the revolutionary new baggage system. Okay, bag rant over. On to Orion proper. My god, is Orion something else. My first ride I got on it was in the very back row, and the first drop of it took me so off guard. Pretty much every ride on Fury 325 and Leviathan, the drop felt the same. Those drops gradually pull you out of your seat while you're cresting the lift before soaring you up into your lap bar. But with Orion, the first drop caught me completely off guard, and I ended up getting yanked into my lap bar. If you've ever felt the whip you get on Yukon's mid-course in the back, it was kind of like that, but with lap bars and 300 feet in the air. The whole rest of the ride is really amazing too, especially the 2 airtime hills after the turnaround. During the time it took to write this script, I actually also went to Canada's Wonderland for their Pressworld preview day, and because of that, I got to get back on Leviathan too. Now, Fury 325 is still by far my favorite of the 3, but I really don't know about Leviathan and Orion. They both have so many strong points, and neither has a moment of downtime from drop to brakes, so it's really hard to decide. I guess we'll see what the final results are at the end of this year, but for now, just know that Kings Island already has 2 new top 10 contenders. After Orion was when the lines really started to hit hard. It was just before 2 at this point, so I decided to have my lunch. I went over to Kings Island's equivalent of the Coaster's Diner, which I forgot the name of, and I ended up waiting more time for this than I did Orion actually. That wait wasn't the worst part, however. See, I had the drink plan on my dining pass, but for some reason it didn't even work for Kings Island. At the end of the day, I ended up buying one of the drink bottles so that I could still use it, but then that bottle wasn't able to be used at Wonderland, but my old drink plan was. So basically, now I have 2 different drink plans that I have to swap between depending on which park I go to. Oh, fun! Anyways, the food was alright, and I hopped on to Shake, Rattle, and Roll afterwards, the park's troika. I rode this way more than I thought I was going to, I think a total of 4 or 5 times over the days. I've been a lot more appreciative of flat rides through the last few years, especially after La Ronde, and so I want to ride as many of the good ones as I can this year. Something else that I've noticed change over the 2 years has been my bulking point. Bulking point is basically how long someone is willing to wait in a queue. Back in 2019, my bulking point was way too high, to the point that I stomach waits over 4 hours for Steel Vengeance. That way of park going is far gone now. I've become a lot more grounded with it, and now I try not to wait any more than 90 minutes for a large attraction if I can help it. One example of this was with Diamondback and Mystic Timbers. I knew going into Rivertown that I liked Mystic Timbers more, but that it's also been way longer since I last rode Diamondback. They both had waits that would have been a little over an hour though, and so I decided to go for Mystic. Mystic Timbers is still probably my favorite coaster at Kings Island. As much as I love every other coaster at Kings Island too, there's just something about Mystic that always kicks my dopamine receptors into overdrive. Soaring through the forests of Rivertowns on a runaway truck is an experience I will never pass up. I've grown an even stronger love for all types of wooden coasters recently, and Mystic Timbers is no exception to that love. In fact, it was probably the coaster that started it. After this wait, I didn't actually end up riding anything for almost 2 hours, and instead, I just walked around the park. Taking it all in, getting some more filming done, and just generally enjoying being back in an amusement park. I think that was the biggest thing for me on this trip. I didn't do what I used to do, trying to cram in as many rides as possible. Nothing but queuing and riding, from rope drop to last call. However, I don't really think that's what I like doing anymore. I think I ended up spending more time on this trip just walking around the park or sitting on a bench and taking it all in, and I had a more fulfilling trip because of it. If there's anything I would want you guys to take away from this video, it's that you should try to take some time to slow down while you're at parks. Don't always think that you need to get on every single coaster in a day or marathon a coaster endlessly. You can and sometimes still should do those things, but I would also say that you should take some time to just take it all in. Appreciate the little details of the park. Go exploring around some of the lesser explored areas. Just take a bit of time to go ride something less thrilling maybe. I only rode 2 more coasters for the rest of Pass Holder Preview Night. Right around an hour before closing, I headed on over to the Bat. I'm still amused by how long the queue is for this ride. It takes such a long time to get back to the station that I always chuckle to myself a bit. Now, I absolutely love the Bat's sister, Vortex, at Canada's Wonderland. That coaster's my 3rd favorite at the park, even more than Behemoth at this point. Maybe it's just because my memory is really foggy, but I never really remembered the Bat being as powy as Vortex. That notion was completely tossed to the window though on this trip, because damn is the Bat great too. I still think I prefer Vortex a little bit over it, but man, it was so much better than I remembered. At the end of this night, I popped back to Mystic for one final ride, and left my first day at Kings Island very satisfied and ready for day 2. Day 2 was Kings Island's opening day proper. I was expecting crowds even worse than preview day, but I was thoroughly surprised when the crowds were a lot smaller. I started my day with a 1-2 punch of Mystic Timbers and Diamondback. Now, I already talked about Mystic, but Diamondback was a more interesting story to me. See, I used to absolutely adore B&M Hypers, to the point that both Behemoth and Diamondback were in my top 10. However, for some reason over the last 2 years, I really fell off my taste in them. Don't get me wrong, they're still incredibly fun rides and I still really love them, but nowhere near as much as I used to. I think the biggest part is that I'm not that huge of a fan of long sustained airtime anymore. I like the shorter pops that you get on most Woodies or on the B&M Gigas. I knew going into Diamondback that I didn't really like B&M Hypers nearly as much as I used to, so I wasn't disappointed by it, but I'm also definitely not as fond of it as I used to be. While I was on the brake run for Diamondback though, I noticed something really funny happening. Backlot Stunt Coaster rolled back, so I decided to head over there next. I love the Backlot Cone at Canada's Wonderland, partly because it's just a damn fun ride, and partly because in my opinion, it's the perfect introductory coaster. Small size, a short launch instead of a lift, and a little surprise at the end, just for kicks. However, that backlot was also responsible for the most painful thing I've ever experienced on a coaster. Near the end of 2021, I rode backlot in the back row, and during the final dive out of the sign, I crashed into the restraint, and my gut got absolutely pulverized. And so, as my comically awful luck struck again, I of course got assigned to the back row. Even though I got sent to the back though, it was actually way better than the Wonderland one. There was no point on the ride that destroyed my gut, and even the final dip was flawless. Not to mention that they still use the effects at Kings Island too, like the helicopter and exploding gas line. After backlot and another quick hop onto Troika, it was time for one of the coasters I was most interested to re-ride, Flight of Fear. Now, Flight of Fear was a coaster that I didn't really remember being particularly outstanding. Yes, I did remember it being a fun ride, but nothing really that noteworthy. I was curious to see if this was still the case, and I'm very happy to report that it was not. Flight of Fear took me really off guard, and I had an amazing time with it. It was a lot more intense than I remember it being, and I still always got anxious whenever we passed under one of the head choppers. The most surprising thing for me though was the finale, or more specifically, the final roll before leaving the spaghetti bowl. I completely forgot this element exists, and I was not prepared for it at all. I left Flight of Fear really satisfied, even if I did have to wait almost 90 minutes for it. I went for another ride on Orion since it had a lot shorter of a wait, only up to just before the show building. Can I just say I love the fact that Orion has a pre-show, and I really hope that Cedar Fair does this for more coasters? After this, I decided to go from the newest coaster in the park to the oldest, and I hopped onto the Racer for its semi-centennial. As far as my memory is concerned, I think this was the first time I actually got to race on the Racer. Every other time it was only running one side, but this time it was running both. Like I said earlier, I've gained such a massive love for all types of wooden coasters, and Racer definitely followed that. Even though I spent the whole time at the park riding by myself, I still had a fun little time trying to start banter with the people opposite of me. Soaring ahead of them felt super rewarding. Even though the determining factors were up to physics alone, it felt like the more hype that we got, the faster the trains would go. The next few hours I spent on less wild rides, including getting on one of my favorite types of rides, the park's Dodgems. I absolutely adore Dodgems and bumper cars in every ride like that. They're such a simple ride concept, but they provide so much fun. Whether you're all by yourself or with a full party, I refuse to believe that you can have a bad time on bumper cars. This trip was no exception either, as I had an absolute blast on them both times I rode. Bumper cars are one of those rides I would always suggest going on when you're at a park. I guarantee you will have a fun time. Sticking to Coney Mall for a little longer, I had my lunch for the day at the Coney Barbecue. This place smelled so good and their fries were really great too. After this, I popped over to a lesser talked about coaster, but a really fun one, Adventure Express. Although they're not the tallest or most forceful type of rides, Aero Mine Trains are just so fun to me. Adventure Express is by far my favorite mine train too. Just like many other Kings Island coasters, Adventure Express sends you out into the wilds of Mason. But unlike those, it travels at a slower speed, so I feel like you can take in a lot more. Of course, the Beast still has a beat in this category, but Adventure Express does make up for that with some really nice set decoration all throughout the ride. Of course, the most infamous of these set decorations is the finale as you climb up the second lift hill. I still am a bit disappointed that there's all this build up for nothing but a brake run afterwards, but it's still a really cool section and I think it does a good job at closing out the ride. After Adventure Express, I spent the rest of the evening going around and getting some more video. I popped over to the area around Banshee and noticed that the wait for it was pretty short, so I decided to hop into line. Then when I got up there, I realized that the wait was really short. Then I saw the ops flying around the station like crazy, sending out trains in like 40 seconds. Because of these crazy ops, I got immediately on 7 times in a row. It reminded me of the good old days, back when I got 10 rides in a row on Fury.
So I've been riding roller coasters for 9 years now, and this is the first time that I think one has made me burst into maniacal laughter. Absolutely maniacal. Oh my god. Banshee is cracked right now. Oh my god, I got very back row, and it's just before 9. Oh my god, I got very back row. You went absolutely soaring. Oh my god, that was insane.
The last of these 2 rides I even grayed out on. Before this, I'd only actually grayed out on 2 other coasters, Le Vampire at La Ronde and Intimidator 305 at King's Dominion. Now you can add Banshee to that list. I was tempted to keep riding Banshee all the way until close, but there was one more thing I knew I had to do that night. See, the other days of the weekend, the park was open for 7 hours, noon to 7. However, for the opening day, they were open for a full 12 hours, 10 to 10. Not only did this mean that it was a longer day at the park, but it also meant that it was darker come closing time. And that was important because of one ride in particular. We all know that the Beast gives the best night rides at Kings Island. I don't really think that's an unpopular opinion, and it's just true. But there is one coaster that I heard put up a fair competition, Orion. Now, you might not think that Orion night rides would be anything super crazy if you haven't seen it at night, but let me just say that when the sun goes low and the lights go up, Orion becomes one of the most spectacular creations in human history. Okay, I might be hyperbolizing there. But really, Orion is such a gorgeous coaster at night. The lighting package that they gave it makes it glow so vibrantly, to the point that you can see it clearly from all the way across the park, even on the darkest of nights. I really hope in the future that Fury 325 could get a similar package too. I'm assuming it's probably going to be out of the question for Leviathan, considering it's right next to a bunch of housing blocks, but I feel like they could do something like this with Fury and just make it so much nicer. That's not even mentioning actually riding it at night. Even though it doesn't always feel like it, Orion also goes pretty far out into the woods. At night, you can definitely notice how far out you really are. Even with that though, the best moment at night is the massive camelback after the turnaround. Normally this is just a really fun moment of airtime, but at night it's a wholly different thing. That hill gives you a beautiful view looking back at the park. Seeing everything all lit up nicely, illuminating the pitch black woods that surround the park, it's really something incredible. The park was closed by the time I got off Orion, but I still took the long way out of the park, just taking in what it's like being at a park after sundown, an experience that I haven't really experienced all that much. Day 3 started with one of the best moments of the trip. See, this day was the first that pass holder early ride time was available. and so I made the most of it by getting 5 rides on Mystic right in a row in the morning. These rides were all really great, and set the tone for what was probably the best day of the trip. After them, I popped back over to Coney Mall again, this time going for Kings Island Autos. I normally pass on car rides, but there was no wait for it, so I decided to hop on. And I'm glad I did too, because I love this little ride. There's just something about it that's really charming, especially with it being silhouetted by Racer. I took some more video around before heading into Area 72 for my second ride on Flight of Fear, since it now had a way shorter of a line. It was still like a half hour, 40-minute wait, but I would say this time it was definitely worth it. I really think Flight of Fear is probably the most overlooked coaster at the park, and it's so fun. Orion was up next for me again, with only a 20-minute wait this time. This was my second back row ride of the trip, and my god, that drop really hits different in the back. Just like the other days, I still spent a long time getting video around the park and getting on some of the smaller rides. One of these was Scrambler. Somehow, I think this was actually my first ever ride on a Scrambler. I built them in pretty much every single roller coaster tycoon park I've ever built, but I guess I hadn't actually ridden one until then. These are another type of great little fun ride. Sometimes the best rides aren't the ones that pull insane G's or go the fastest or the tallest, but sometimes they're just the ones that toss you all around. Something I've noticed is that no matter how down I am on any given day, I've never been able to resist popping on a smile on a flat ride. Even something just as gentle as carousels. If they've got that organ running, you can bet that I'm grinning ear to ear. After this and another ride on Racer, I decided it was time for lunch. I headed over to Fest House, probably the best dining location at any Cedar Fair park. I'm super excited for the equivalents of this that are coming to Canada's Wonderland and Cedar Point, because these places are just some of the best spots in the park. If you don't know what Fest House is, it's basically this massive dining hall that has all different types of food options, live entertainment, all packed in this nice large building with a ton of dining tables. Fest House has such a nice atmosphere that even though I was already done my food by 2:15, I ended up just staying in the hall until 2:40, enjoying the atmosphere and the live performances going on. I took some more video over in Action Zone before what I would say was the highlight of my entire trip, and it starts with Invertigo. You might not guess that Invertigo would be the highlight of someone's Kings Island trip, but for me, this ride and the stuff after it was definitely the best part. I rode next to this really nice fellow who started striking up a conversation with not just me, but also the people across from us on Invertigo. While waiting for the train to dispatch and on the lift up, all 4 of us had a blast talking to each other. Once the ride ended, I kept talking with him, striking up conversations about all different sorts of amusement park stuff. We probably talked for like 20 or 25 minutes, and that's when I found out that he also actually has a YouTube channel, Dropterpolis360. He also makes some really great content, and I would definitely suggest giving it a watch and dropping him a sub. The 2 of us parted ways, and after that, I spent some time going around getting some more video. As you can tell, that was a pretty common thing for me on this trip. I think I ended up with 251 clips for a total of almost 6 gigabytes. I should also mention that everything you see in this video, aside from POVs, was filmed by me during this trip. I used to use my iPhone 6s to film this stuff, but over the last few months, I decided to upgrade to a 2020 iPhone SE. I don't use a DSLR, mainly just because I think that a phone is more than equipped enough. The SE can go all the way to up to 4K at 60 frames per second, and that's more than I'll ever need since I usually film at 1080p at 60. One of the best things of the SE that I made a lot of use of on this trip was the way better zoom. Looking at 6S zoomed videos, they all look incredibly pixelated and just really not that great. However, with the SE, I really don't notice a ton of pixelation. In fact, I feel like some shots I've taken with the zoom on my SE almost look on par to old 6S clips at no zoom. Just thought I should talk about how I filmed these videos and a little bit behind the scenes. Anyways, the next thing I went to ride was Woodstock Express. I've now ridden 3 of these PTC kiddie coasters, and I can say this is definitely my favorite of the 3. The one at Wonderland always has way too long of a line, and the one at Carowinds I got impaled on, but this one has neither of those, plus it just runs better in my opinion. I spent a bunch more time in Planet Snoopy after this, getting some more video too. I really debated going on Race for Your Life Charlie Brown, but I decided against it because I wanted another ride on Mystic and I didn't want to get too wet. I'm obviously not super well versed in kids areas, but I can definitely tell why Kings Island consistently wins the golden ticket for best kids area. After these little stints in Planet Snoopy, I headed over to the Kings Island Miami Valley Railroad. This is definitely my favorite little train ride, and it gives perfect filming spots for both Mystic and Diamondback. The whole trip I've been trying to get videos of the back half of Mystic Timbers while on the train, But on my final 2 rides, I was able to get 2 pretty much perfect shots from it. A job well done, if I do say so. This was when the day was really winding down for me. I think the next hour and a half was just taking videos and walking around. That was before I decided to get on my final ride of the trip. I didn't realize that this was going to be my final ride at the time, but I think it fits well. That being one final ride on Banshee. The ride that started and ended this trip. This was another pretty much perfect ride on it, and afterwards I just kinda decided, yeah, I think I'm content with leaving now. Before I used to stay open to close every day to maximize how many rides I could get. But this year, I think I'm gonna end up taking things slower. This wasn't just a one-time thing either. When I was at Canada's Wonderland as well, I decided to leave 2 hours before the park closed. Partly because of traffic, partly because the next day was a school day, but mostly just because I felt like I was ready to leave. If there's anything to take away from my experience at Kings Island, it's that it's okay to take things slowly at parks. Don't always force yourself to hurry around the park, trying to get on everything as many times as you can. Take some time to stop and smell the roses. Enjoy the fact that you're in an amusement park while you can. So if you've made it this far, I just have one question for you. Why? Why would you listen to a random guy talk about his weekend at an amusement park for however many minutes this is? Heck, I even got really bored during this, and I'm the one who's making the thing. Well, if you did, firstly, thank you. I appreciate that you're willing to listen to my rambles. Secondly, there is just one more thing I think I should wrap up before I'm making this video. Back in 2020, I made a video ranking the different coasters at Kings Island, and this is what that list looked like. You might be wondering how this compares to my feelings on the coasters now that I've gotten fresh rides on all of them except for Great Pumpkin Coaster and Flying Ace. Well, here's what I estimate my list looks like. I say estimate because my feelings about coasters fluctuate a lot more than they used to, so between the time they took to write, record, edit, and eventually upload this, my feelings on these rides probably have changed. Something that's interesting to note about Kings Island is that there isn't a single bad coaster on the lineup. Canada's Wonderland obviously has Time Warp and Flight Deck, and even Cedar Point has Corkscrew, a coaster that I wouldn't really consider that good. However, every coaster at Kings Island is a perfect spot in its lineup, and I would consider all of them at the very least very good coasters. Even something like Adventure Express. It's an incredibly fun ride, and I absolutely love Aero Mine Trains. So, I think that's all that there is to cover. This was a recap of my 3 days at Kings Island from April 15th to April 17th of 2022. Thank you all for watching, and if you've made it this far, I really appreciate you all. Take care and ride on.